You're listening to EE Times On Air, and this is EE Times Current. I'm Taylor Marvin. Welcome to Brains and Machines, a deep dive into neuromorphic engineering and biologically inspired technology. In this episode, Dr. Katie Schuman talks about evolving architectures for really efficient, if tangled, neural networks. Your hosts are Dr. Sunny Bains of University College London and Dr. Giulia D'Angelo of the Czech Technical University in Prague.
Welcome to Brains and Machines. I am Giulia D'Angelo.
And I'm Sunny Bains.
In today's episode, Sunny is talking to Dr. Katie Schuman of the University of Tennessee at Knoxville. After the interview, we will be talking to Ralph Etienne-Cummings from Johns Hopkins University about the issues raised.
Thanks, Giulia. Until the deep learning revolution, Katie was one of the relatively small number of people in neuromorphic engineering with a computer science background rather than physics, biology, or electronics. Before going back to join the faculty at her alma mater, she worked at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, working in evolutionary optimization, deep learning, data analytics, and of course, neuromorphic computing. Katie is a well-known figure in the community and is perhaps best known as an organizer of ICONS, the International Conference on Neuromorphic Systems. She's also a regular participant at NICE, the Neuro-Inspired Computational Elements Conference. There are links to her work and some of the specific papers we'll be discussing on our website. You can check them out at brainsandmachines.net. To prepare for this interview, Katie and I talked in person. We then did the recording on a call. Katie Schuman, welcome to Brains and Machines.
Thanks for having me.
Can you start by telling us a little bit about your technical background?
Sure. I did my bachelor's degree in computer science and math at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. And then I did my PhD also in computer science. It didn't start in neuromorphic computing, but it ended up in neuromorphic computing after the journey throughout the dissertation.
Tell us a little bit about that journey. How did you first learn about neuromorphic engineering, and what was it that attracted you to it?
I took a class when I was an undergraduate student called Biologically Inspired Computing, and we learned about spiking neural networks in that class, as well as evolutionary algorithms. And I fell in love with both of those topics, but I never saw myself as a person who would be involved in hardware at all. I was very much a computer scientist by training and didn't really have a huge interest in hardware. But a couple years into my graduate research, which was marrying together spiking neural networks and evolutionary algorithms, a new professor joined the faculty at the University of Tennessee, Mark Dean. And Mark had come from IBM and was very much a hardware guy. He has a lot of original patents on the IBM PC, and he just loves to build things. And I sat down with Mark and told him what I was doing, and he said, we should build that in hardware. And we started doing it from there. Lots of iterations with Mark on what I was doing in software, what was important about each of the different components of my particular neural network approach, and then figuring out how to actually map that into a hardware implementation. And Mark very much took the lead on the original design and started training up a whole set of students who were also falling in love with what we discovered was neuromorphic computing. Pretty quickly after that, we started participating in neuromorphic computing meetings and really interacting with the community more broadly. And so I stumbled into the field accidentally. I never pictured myself being a person that would be dealing with hardware regularly, but it's very much a fun field to be in right now and very exciting to be able to contribute to the development of a new type of hardware implementation.
Just out of curiosity and for completeness, what did you start off doing your PhD in?
Spiking neural networks and evolutionary algorithms, but it was very much just a pure software simulation environment and figuring out how to evolve spiking neural networks. And because I had no hardware experience, it's like, I can't do this myself. And it really was Mark who came in and said, oh, we could absolutely do this if we had a broader team. So that was really the driving force behind it.
So you're best known in the community for taking this evolutionary approach to neuromorphic networks, spiking networks, evolving both the network architecture and the weights. Can you talk a little bit about that work and how it's developed?
Yeah, so this started, as I mentioned, with my dissertation research. I really did fall in love with both spiking neural networks and evolutionary algorithms at the same time. And when I started to learn more about spiking neural networks, one of the things that I kept bumping up against in the literature I was reading was, how do you actually set all of these different parameters that you might have in a neuron model? How do you set all of the different parameters you might have in a synapse model? And then looking to the brain for inspiration, there's a lot of connectivity that is not feed forward in nature. So how do you come up with more brain-like connectivity? And I was learning about spiking neural networks at the same time. And so I was very much using an evolutionary approach to help guide my intuition about what should the networks look like? What are the structures that are needed to solve different types of problems? How do you leverage things like synaptic or axonal delay, like these timing components in networks? And so that was really the driving force behind using an evolutionary approach to design both the structure and the parameters simultaneously, because I was also finding that they were inextricably linked, like the structure depended on the parameters and vice versa. So evolving them together made sense to me. And it also made sense to me from a biological perspective of, when you're learning, you don't just start from scratch. You're building on a structure that has been evolved over millennia. And so how do you come up with what that structure looks like? It made sense for me to take an evolutionary approach.
So that's almost like a kind of epigenetics of neural networks, sort of the step before you're born.
Exactly.
Kind of
Yeah. So like I said, we started with structure and parameters being evolved simultaneously. But since my dissertation work, we've gone on to actually look at doing evolution of structure and then using learning rules to tune the parameters. And more recently, we've even moved into evolving those learning rules as well. So figuring out how to learn and evolving how learning actually might work in an artificial system, because we have ideas of how learning works in biological systems, but are there other options for how learning might work? That's something that we're exploring with evolution in our simulations.
So one of the features of your work has been the consistent demonstration that recurrent networks are both more efficient and more capable than the multi-layered feed-forward networks that we are used to. Can you talk about the experiments you did and the results?
Yeah, so from the beginning with my evolutionary approach, which is called EONS, Evolutionary Optimization for Neuromorphic Systems, because we didn't have these structural restrictions, we were always evolving highly recurrent, usually very sparse networks that our group started calling hairballs. They kind of look like hairballs. There's synapses in every direction. And when you visualize them, that's very much what they look like. So we hadn't been really doing any feed-forward analysis with our work. And it's only been more recently, we were noticing anecdotally that these networks tended to be really small, like on the orders of tens of neurons and a couple hundred synapses. And we did a work a couple of years ago where we were designing spiking neural networks to drive small-scale autonomous vehicles in a race car environment. And our networks that were evolved considerably outperformed the imitation learning approach, which wasn't entirely surprising to us because it was better able to generalize than the imitation learning approaches were. But the networks were orders of magnitude smaller also, which my hardware friends were excited about because that meant that they could actually implement these in a really efficient way. So we did a more recent experiment where we systematically looked at a variety of different tasks and compared our evolutionary approach in evolving the structure with feed-forward networks. And once again, we found that getting the same level of performance, which we could in several of these tasks, we could do it with, again, an order of magnitude fewer neurons and synapses. So from our perspective, there's a lot of promise there. The problem is a lot of the algorithms that have been developed for traditional artificial neural networks that we're now mapping onto spiking neural networks were built for feed-forward networks or for relatively limited recurrence in these networks. So how do you train a hairball is an ongoing question, but there's a very clear potential advantage to using these types of structures moving forward.
So I'm going to come back to this problem of how do you train these things. But before we do that, can you go on and explain why these recurrent networks are so powerful? Obviously, we know they are because they work, but can you give us some intuition as to why that should be?
I really think we're leveraging the temporal domain in a way that sort of these more limited recurrent networks aren't, because we aren't restricting the structure in any way. Any two neurons can be connected by a synapse, even more than one synapse, with different time delays associated with them. There can be different timescales that are exploited within the same network. So when you're doing something like a control task where timing is critical, I think these temporal dynamics that we allow for in the networks can really be exploited by the evolutionary approach in designing those networks. I should mention that one of our recent results, which we haven't published yet, but we have actually shown in a cart pole task, so a pole balancing task that you might find on reinforcement learning environments, that you can have a spiking neural network that has all uniform, same numbered weights, same number of thresholds, and solve the pole balancing task with just different time delays in the synaptic connections. So all the weights are the same, all the thresholds are the same, just the delays. So setting those temporal dynamics in a network can be really powerful, especially for control type applications where timing really matters.
So shall we go back to that harder nut? How do we train these things? Now, I know this is a work in progress, but what is your sense of the directions in which progress is going to be made here?
I'm most excited about local learning rules in combination with meta-learning. I think these more biologically inspired learning mechanisms are going to be the answer, because those are going to work in these sparse recurrent networks, whereas something like a backpropagation style approach is not going to work.
Why don't you give us an example of a local learning rule?
Of course. So the canonical local learning rule that a lot of neuromorphic hardware implements is spike timing dependent plasticity, or STDP. This is like Hebbian learning, so neurons that fire together wire together, but with a notion of time. STDP has been shown to be useful in some isolated use cases, but I think more broadly, as we continue to learn more about different types of learning in biological neural systems, and particularly as we modulate those learning approaches with meta-learning procedures that change the learning rule over time and adapt to the learning rules over time, and even change the learning rules throughout the same network, I think that's really going to be the key. So I'm really excited about a lot of that work that's going on in the learning to learn movement. And like I said, personally, we're working on evolving learning rules. So I think there's a lot of potential to use those to help tune parameters, but it's going to kind of require us to be willing to let go of these gradient descent type algorithms, which is uncomfortable. And so I think there's always going to be applications where those algorithms make more sense. But I think there are also tons of applications where using this type of network architecture is going to make a lot more sense.
This, I guess, neatly brings us to the idea of co-design, right? Because we're talking about designing the algorithms and we're talking about designing the network itself. Now, I know that's something that you're very interested in. Would you like to talk about where your work is going in that area?
Yes, co-design fits very naturally into this idea of the hairball network, because a lot of neuromorphic architectures are not built to support this style of network connectivity. Over the last decade, I've worked very closely with Garrett Rose, who is another professor here at the University of Tennessee, developing architectures for these types of networks. They are built on memristive technologies, so similar to a lot of other work that's going on in neuromorphic systems, but unlike a lot of work going on with memristors, it's not crossbars. It is architectures that are meant to be able to implement these sorts of connectivity. And so it's made up more of neural cores that have memristors in them. So we do a lot of that co-design loop of iterating back and forth between the algorithm and the hardware. And then I'll also just briefly say, from the perspective of the learning rules, we also do a lot of co-design work with people who are looking at emerging devices and materials for neuromorphic computing. And a lot of those systems have sort of natively plasticity-like behaviors in the device and materials and how they respond to stimuli. And those don't necessarily look exactly like how plasticity looks in the brain, but they are another way to provide inspiration for how plasticity might work in a neuromorphic system.
Okay, this is all super interesting. So, as you say in your beautifully titled paper, Embracing the Hairball, they are difficult to reason about. Now, this has always been a criticism of neural networks anyway, right? That they are black boxes, and that makes it difficult for people to figure out, well, this is a sort of black box on top of a black box. You didn't even know how it worked to begin with. Now you're training it up to do something even different again. As an academic, as a researcher, as someone trying to make progress, I know you're also a mathematician, to add to those labels. Can you see affordances into these networks so that you will be able to analyze them in some sensible way?
So we've done some initial analysis. Because our networks are pretty small, we can look at them and we can watch what they're doing when they're solving a problem. And particularly my colleague, Jim Plank, he will sit down with the best performing networks we get out of eons for different tasks and watch what they're doing. We have visualizations where we can pair it with the application and exactly see, okay, this neuron is firing here, which is triggering this behavior, and this subnetwork, which is triggering this. And we're trying to scale up some of this analysis, particularly to look for things like motifs in these network structures that are emerging that can help us explain, okay, we're seeing this common network structure across hundreds or thousands of these networks. Why? What is it doing? Why is it there? And can we actually pin that down and then start to see these networks instead of individual neurons and synapses as being building blocks that are coming together to form this larger network that's performing this task? In terms of where we're at in explainability, I think we're in the same boat as most people with neural networks of it works and we can try to go in and look and make some conclusions about it. But especially as the networks start to get larger for us, because we're doing that manually right now, that becomes a much harder process.
Are you aware of I think it's Lagor-Spinosman paper from, 2015. It's called STICK, and it's about building primitives out of recurrent networks?
Yes, but we haven't actually used those as building blocks, but I'm reminded of that paper now. And that would actually be a cool thing to do because we want to give eons bigger components to deal with than just neurons and synapses. And using these as primitives, or as we learn about what primitives should be, giving those as the hierarchical building blocks for an evolutionary process would be really exciting to do. And this sort of analysis on understanding like the networks that are emerging from these evolutionary processes is something that my students and I are working on right now, because through our evolutionary process, we generate a ton of data in the form of networks and how they perform on tasks. And doing that analysis and learning and subgraph analysis within those networks is something we're very interested in doing and trying to identify what these primitives might be that we could then build from, and also relate those to the application characteristics and start to predict if I have a new application, it's similar to this one in some way. Here are sort of the pieces that you might expect that you would need to be able to be successful.
One of the other things that reading your papers made me think about is about the mappings from networks to networks. So I was particularly wondering if you could train up a deep neural network, would there be features that you could take from it that you could then map on to a recurrent neural network? Is that even a mathematically sensible question to ask?
So one of the things that we've talked about doing is composing these networks together, because there are certain types of things that these feed-forward convolutional architectures, for example, do really well. And connecting those up with our sort of recurrent hairball networks and trying to exploit the strengths of both simultaneously. So you could imagine, for example, using a spiking convolutional neural network to do like a vision feature extraction, and then your hairball network being your motor control system, and sort of pairing those together, but using the features that come out of the vision system. That's something that we've been really interested in doing. We haven't taken a pre-trained feed-forward network and plugged that into eons as a starting point and evolved from there. But there's nothing that would keep us from doing that other than the networks are pretty large. So the search space gets pretty big. But that's totally something you could do, is start from a known network that does something you know is useful and iterate and evolve from there.
Actually, that is great that you brought that up, because that was also a question on my list, which was bigness of the evolutionary process.
Yep.
And you've mostly been working with relatively small numbers of neurons. Obviously, if you're going to be able to do something bigger than that, it's more computer intensive, slower.
A lot of the problems that our group is dealing with, you can typically get something in a day or two on the laptop. However, when you get to more complex problems and you're scaling up to larger networks, that is a real challenge currently for EONS. So EONS uses, in evolutionary algorithm language, we use a direct representation, which means in our algorithm, we are directly representing and optimizing every aspect of the network, all of the structure, all of the parameters. That's not how biology works. Biology has what we would call an indirect representation, DNA, that is then used to create the overall system through a complex process, going through RNA and proteins and all of those things. We can also, and in fact, one of my graduate students is exploring indirect representations of spiking neural networks. What does something like DNA look like to encode the features that you would need for a spiking neural network is a key research problem. But if we're able to address that, we could start to use these indirect representations to evolve much larger spiking neural networks to try to attack these more complex tasks.
And do you do hardware in the loop evolution?
We can, and we have in the past. So if you do have neuromorphic hardware available to you, then you can absolutely use that as part of your training process to accelerate it. For us, a lot of the hardware that we prototype and develop on in our lab, we build prototypes in FPGA, field programmable gate array systems. And in order to really get hardware in the loop to work well, you need communication to be fast, which can be a challenge for some of those systems. Particularly if you have not thought about communication in the design of your system, if you're only thinking about deploying in like a real-time application, you may not be thinking about high-speed communication as part of that, depending on what real-time means for your problem. So in that case, it's not going to be well suited to our hardware in the loop evolution, because we really need that to be fast, because we need to evaluate hundreds of thousands of these. So some of the things we found when we have FPGA as hardware in the loop, if you're not running multiple networks at a time, the communication costs can actually override the benefit that you would get from the speed up of the hardware. So that has been a challenge we've had to overcome. What we've done is run a bunch of networks simultaneously on the hardware. So do one load operation for like 50 networks, run all of those simultaneously, get all of their results off, and then you can really see a speed up. But then that also requires larger hardware implementations to be able to realize it. So you sort of have all of these trade-offs that you have to think about when you're doing hardware in the loop. So it's another thing to consider as part of the co-design process.
So when you go back to the idea of, okay, you've got this network, you've identified an optimal network for a particular task, maybe an edge task where you want something to be really teeny tiny and super efficient from an energy standpoint. How do you then take that algorithm, that set of data, and then impose it on hardware in the most efficient possible way?
Yeah, so this is definitely a trade-off in terms of what neuromorphic systems that are deployed should look like. And I think a lot of the systems that are being developed more with reprogrammability in mind, and not necessarily particular application, like they're thinking about making it flexible for multiple applications. But we have done some work in our group with actually analyzing what savings do you get if you hard code a network into the hardware and say, I know this is what my network is. I know that this is going to work for my task more broadly. I know my task isn't going to change, which isn't always a good assumption, but maybe you know that. I need the savings. And what we had found, at least in a fully digital CMOS system, we could get about a 10x, an order of magnitude savings in size and power consumption by moving to this custom design network rather than using a more flexible architecture that's meant to be reprogrammed.
So you would be getting, say, a 10 or 100-fold increase just from moving to neuromorphic, and then you could get another tenfold or more by going to a specific neuromorphic network rather than some general purpose network. So the ASIC of the neuromorphic world.
Exactly. Yeah. So you can definitely get that level of savings if you have a problem that you're willing to take the cost to custom fabricate systems, then that is definitely something that can give you additional savings.
So it sounds like you are looking at sort of all levels of the neuromorphic stack, from the really big mainframe computers. Oak Ridge has just got a big Luigi tower or whatever it is, to the tiny little edge applications. Where would you expect to see a network that was designed by evolution arrive first?
I think that's going to be the edge. And I think that is also going to be where neuromorphic sort of emerges first as a use case, particularly for applications like remote sensing, autonomous systems, robotics of various forms, where you have size, weight, and power restrictions. All of those types of applications, I think that's where both neuromorphic and evolutionary trained spiking neural networks for neuromorphic are going to come into play. That is really the application domain that we have targeted initially. At the same time, I am very much screaming in the ears of the supercomputing community about the opportunities for neuromorphic as coprocessors and their future systems. Selfishly, I could 100% use a neuromorphic coprocessor today to do evolutionary hardware in the loop training, of course. But there's a lot of other really cool applications of neuromorphic for HPC systems, including on traditional computing problems like graph algorithms and optimization, and even in modeling and simulation. So this is something that I'm very passionate about, having come a little bit from that community, and that I am a huge advocate for within that community, going to their meetings and saying the word neuromorphic as many times as I possibly can in their presence.
One last thing before we finish. I know you do go to a lot of meetings, neuromorphic and otherwise. I wondered if there was anything that you had seen, any trends that you've noticed in the last couple of years that you think are going to be really fruitful, but we're only just starting to get a grip on.
In a word, software. For a long time in the neuromorphic meetings, it was dominated by hardware implementations, which is great. We have a huge diversity of hardware, but there was hardly anyone talking about software systems. And once again, I'm a computer scientist. I need software and know that we need software to be able to actually effectively use these systems. A trend that I've seen over the last couple of years is more and more open source software systems being developed, frameworks coming out that are trying to make these systems more usable. A common refrain that I hear when I'm in a neuromorphic audience is that we need something that makes neuromorphic computing and spiking neural networks as accessible to the community as tools like PyTorch and TensorFlow did for deep learning. Now, we have such a diversity of types of algorithms, the way you can use spiking neural networks, that even though we have tools like PyTorch and TensorFlow, they only give you a subset of functionalities for neuromorphic. So we need a much broader software ecosystem to really support these systems. And it's been really great to see that starting to emerge. But we really need to coalesce as a community around building out what this system looks like and making these hardware systems accessible to people that are outside of our community.
Katie Schuman, thank you so much for coming on to Brains and Machines.
Thank you again for the opportunity.
Thanks, Sunny. It has been incredibly interesting listening to Katie, especially because she works on evolutionary algorithms, which I believe we have never talked about in this podcast. And for more about Katie Schuman, please go to brainsandmachines.net. Now, we welcome back our regular commentator, Professor Ralph Etienne-Cummings from Johns Hopkins University.
Hi, guys. Happy to be back.
So, I'd like to start with a question that I'm sure all of us has had in the past. And I'd like to understand from you guys your insights in this, which is how much come from evolution and how much come from learning? This is an open question, right? We should do this and then we can apply some learning afterwards. What do you think about this?
So, having dabbled a little bit into the genetic algorithms for training spiking neural networks in particular was one of my students' work, Alex Russell and Gary Orchard, when they were actually doing their undergraduate work with me and before they became PhD students. But anyway, essentially, it's a combination, right? So there's one layer, which is what is the general architecture that you're trying to construct? And for us, it was a walking robot that we were trying to control with a CPG. The second layer then is what are the weights that connect the different pieces of the CPG in order to get the dynamics that you're looking for. And then the third part is how do you then prune the network that you've constructed in order to get the right profile of walking without using too many spiking units and also to get the right timing, which is something that I know that Katie talks about in her discussions. So all three of these have to work together. So you end up with a top-down first, then the genetic algorithms refines what's needed, and then the last part, you end up using kind of a standard learning mechanism to tackle the problem.
I wondered about this. So I've been trying to do this same thing of partitioning what the different pieces are. And one of the things that I think is a little bit different about Katie's work is that she allows you to evolve the architecture a little bit in a way that would not and could not be done by learning in the conventional sense. And I think that's what I really like, is this thing of having these recurrences and how they're used. And if you like telling the AI that it has to have connections that it wouldn't necessarily have had otherwise if you just had a regular layer-to-layer interconnection, I think it's a little bit different. And that's one of the reasons I find it so interesting.
Yeah, so that's a good point, Sunny, in the sense that it's easy to prune out connections, right? So you can strip the architecture to make it simpler, but to add in connections is usually not part of a classical learning thing, right? If you don't have the W between the two units, you're not going to strengthen it, right? It's easy to weaken it and take it out, but not the other way. So I think that's a really cool point, that you add new connections, you add new projections, which ends up being somewhat like an axon projection. That is a growth that you would find in biology.
Yeah, and I think that's also part of this interesting trade-off. So we talk in the interview about how hugely computationally intensive these genetic algorithms are. And obviously, the more neurons you're trying to model, the more unfeasible it is to model the whole thing or to optimize the whole network. But it got me thinking about that point of, I come from an optoelectronics background, and I remember very early on in electronic imaging when we were just starting to think about partitioning between the optics, the sensors, and the algorithms that were processing what was coming through the sensors, and understanding that you could have optics which had maybe poor characteristics, but if they were known, they could be compensated by the sensors, or sensors that could be compensated by the algorithms. And so it's that thing in engineering of knowing you can actually design things so that they're poor and maybe cheap, which is what you really want, right? But they're poor in a way that can be compensated for further down the chain. And I think that's what might become really interesting, is how do we evolve the network to the point where learning can then take over after the network has been evolved, right? So you evolve the network, you build it in hardware, and then learning can really well take over the places where it's not going to be quite right because the hardware isn't now perfect. So I think there are interesting partitioning issues here, but that could be really fruitful in the end.
Different errors, if you will, or impurities and so on and so forth in the sensor quality. That can be done by calibration. So this is different, right? This is now learning how to adapt to observations. And the observations may not be static, right? So in a sense that if you think about correcting a camera, the fixed pattern noise is static, right? The gain error is known. You can measure it, but once you measure it, it's fixed. In this case, it seems to me that it's going to be a lot harder than that. So that's why learning, I think, is more important.
I very much agree. I don't think you can push the analogy with the sensors that far, but
Right.
It's about optimizing the network for the next kind of optimization. So for instance, you could optimize it to the nth degree, But then that level of optimization may not be that useful if the learning is then going to take it off in a different direction. So it's about thinking through what are the parameters that tell us what is good enough for the evolutionary part of that trajectory, and where should that be handed off so that it's ready for the learning part of that trajectory.
I would say the difficulty that she encounters is that because she can be adding not just new connections, but new units possibly, right? New neurons and new components, right? That's an infinite space. Basically, I could add anything, right? It could grow indiscriminately, right? So the optimized growth, if you will, of the network, the change in the architecture has to be contained. And that's where some optimization comes into play for sure. So then once you get to that, then the next thing is, if you're trying now to tweak the network as it's actually behaving, is doing something in real life now, is solving some problem. The issue is, I think, is that at some point you have an environment that is very different than what you had previously learned. So all the connections and the weights and so on may not apply to this other domain that is which you're applying it. So now you've got to almost relearn, right, if you will, or at least change some of the learning parameters and changing rules or whatever in order for it to be something different for the next thing that you're applying. And I think that's what you're referring to, Sunny, right? So that's where her notion of meta-learning comes into place, learning to learn. So in some conditions, this is the rule that works. In this other condition, this is the rules that work, right? Usually we as engineers want to use one rule for everything. We want it to work all the time, no matter what the condition is, as long as we're solving the same problem. But the environment changes, right? And we don't like to jump between different rules. But she has the ability with her GAs in order to pick, if you will, the right rule in the right condition to get the best result at all times. And I think that's really cool.
So now that you've said meta-learning, we have meta-learning and evolutionary algorithms, right? Okay, in one case, I am learning to learn, and in another case, I'm evolving the network, okay? But the real difference is just that in one case, I'm adding more units if I need it, and in the other case, I don't, and I just learn the connections and the weights in the connections. Is this the difference?
Not quite. I would say it's the following, and I'm going to put this at a very high level now, right? So suppose you have Hebbian learning capabilities, SDTP, you have gradient descent, or you have just a template base, right? Let's say these were the entirety of your vocabulary of what kind of learning rules you could do. Now you have a layer that sits on top of that, and to pick which one is appropriate based on the conditions that you're experiencing. So that decider, that unit that sits above those learning rules, have to pick which one to use at what time. And then when they've picked, then the right learning rule then gets applied to the network. And that's where the tweaking of the weights and maybe the adding even of units might actually happen. But it's selecting the learning process, right? The learning rule is this meta step. So that's the learning to learn. And then to actually do the learning. So one is, which one do you pick? And then how do you use it once you picked it? So that may be the partitioning that you're referring to.
So one of the things I realized that I did not discuss with Katie was about whether this optimization would cause problems later if you extend your task beyond what you had originally thought it was going to be. And I suspect it must, right? But I guess that's always a problem of evolutionary algorithms, is you have to know what it is that you want to optimize for.
And she speaks about this in some ways, right? She talks about being over-specific versus generalization. She talks about imitation learning as being an example that they have implemented where it's very specific and, it doesn't generalize well. So you won't do as well, right? But in their technique, because of the GA layer, I presume, that provides them a little bit more flexibility. And they've shown, I guess, with the eons, that essentially allows them to kind of jump over the limitations that a strict imitation learning approach would have limited them. So they get more, like you said, Sunny, more functionality that would not be allowed in the original learning process.
So one thing that was interesting that she said is that she's going to analyze this network related to a specific task. And this, I liked it a lot. And one thing that I don't understand is that I was following a seminar yesterday, and recurrent neural network seems to be, let's say, not used anymore in the community, or the community is leaving them from space-based models. And we have also lots of learning rules, SDDP, triplet, and so on and so forth, right? But why do we keep thinking that we will find the best solution? The best solution for what? I really like your example before, Ralph, where you were saying, okay, we have some sort of agent that is deciding which learning rule to pick. And I think that depends extremely from the task that we are tackling, right?
Exactly that. I mean, you have to pick the right one. And this is, again, something that's encountered in lifelong learning, right? Because online learning, lifelong learning, data is coming in all the time. Environments are changing. You don't want to have catastrophic forgetting where you've forgotten everything that you learned before. So you have to have a mechanism for refining without necessarily throwing out everything that you learned previously, right? So even when you're switching between the different learning rules or learning rates or whatever, you have to be able to maintain some of these previously learned factors, right? So you may have learned something that's specific for that task at hand, talking about pole balancing, it might be a pole with a certain weight and a certain distribution of that weight. And now if I put in a new pole with different physical properties, I want to be able to use the stuff that's there before, and that's part of the genetic algorithm stuff that she talks about, right? Is reuse of what we know, and then to refine that. And to refine it, we may need to use a different learning mechanism. So then you had something that was perfect, if you will, for balancing that one pole, which will not balance the next pole. But you have to somehow still be able to use that information to go to the next pole, right? So that's, I think, where moving away from the perfect example to the next one is important.
But I know that they've done work with eons where they're doing things like assuming a wide variety, for instance, of variations in the hardware, because that's the most obvious thing to do, because you know that the hardware is not going to be perfect. So you throw in that variability in the evolutionary process so that what you get out is more general. And likewise, they can throw in other kinds of variability into the system. Essentially, they're adding noise while the thing is evolving.
But that's fixed, though. I mean, not fixed in the sense of you know exactly. Fixed in the sense that you know the distribution and you basically try to fit the distribution, right? But I guess what I'm trying to say is, what if you are encountering something entirely new? Like what you're referring to, Sunny, as that next problem. It still has the same common core. Like I walk around the city and I see buildings, and then I go to the country and I no longer see buildings, but I see trees, right? But the same tools are being used, right? Vision, understanding whether it's going to fall on me or not. I have to use a different learning rule, so to speak, to know what to do with trees as opposed to what to do with buildings. So that's where the tweak is. It's not so much about just dealing with the noise of buildings, but it's something completely new when you're going to see trees, I think.
But that's why it's at an early stage, is you have to see how best to use these tools so that you can evolve in a sensible way to begin with, and then you can deploy those networks at the right level of task. Right? If you want something to go on forever or to have enough real-time reconfigurability, I mean, we tend not to talk about that as much as we used to. I've always said that one of my fascinations with neural networks from an early stage, because I was fascinated by micromechanics and things, was this idea that you might have reconfigurable and yet hardwired connections in the brain, that you could actually physically change the structure of a chip over time. And they're looking at that, right? We talked about that with Beatrice Nojeda and her colleagues in Groningen, where literally you can have these connections that grow over time based on the input flowing through the chip. All very theoretical, I understand that. But I wonder, again, whether if you have an evolutionary platform to get you to such a place, and then you can have some reconfigurability over that, and then you can have the sort of more bread and butter learning that we talk about, where you're just exploiting the connections that are there and turning them up or down, so to speak. You're just changing the weights. That gives you a hugely rich set of changes. I mean, that's almost as rich as what you have in the brain in a sense, right? You've got physical plasticity as well as weight plasticity. That could be really interesting, but because the materials are so speculative at the moment, we're very far from that right now.
Exactly. I mean, architecturally, then finally refinement, right? So first you change, you set the architecture and then you learn the refinements to make it work better. One of the things that you touched on, which is explainability, right? That continues to be difficult to understand whether the learning process or the learning result is explainable or not, right? Maybe if you partition it into these three different layers, as I kind of talked about, then you can explain kind of why the decision was made to pick which learning rules, then why the architecture became what it did, and then lastly, how did the refinements of the weights allow you to prune and to keep certain connectivity that makes work most efficient. So I think explainability might also potentially benefit from these types of layered learning stages. She hit on hardware in the loop, I think super critical. That's where neuromorphics and a lot of the things that she's doing will come into play. So which hardware stays in the loop? What do you throw out? What do you add? So that becomes really, again, architecture of the system. So learning at the architectural stage. The other part I think that was really interesting in what she talked about was two things, I guess. One saying that neuromorphics is going to be really relevant at the edge. I agree completely. And the last part is when she basically said software. While she was necessarily referring to software emulation potentially and software application, I also think software control of hardware is super important, and that might also link in the whole hardware in the loop.
If I can follow up on this, I'd like just to say some of the softwares that we use, because I think it's important for listeners that do not know about neuromorphic software available, which is SNN Port by Jason Estragan, NIR, Neuromorphic Intermediate Representation, Tonic to work with events and their representation. So this, I think, is important to just let it know. And the last thing that for me is really important, she said also that our coding the first layers could save up our consumption, which is what I'm trying to do too. So I will read a lot more about her and her work, because I do agree a lot with her in this regard.
So we will add a link to a resource that will tell you about different types of software for neuromorphic engineering to the Brains and Machines website, to this episode, so that you can see it if you're interested in following up on any of these packages.
Okay, guys, I guess this is a good place to stop the conversation. So thanks to Sunny, as usual, for her interesting interview, and to Ralph for his insightful comments. In the next episode, we talk to Rodney Brooks, Emeritus Professor at the Computer Science and AI Lab at MIT, and founder of iRobot Corporation, Rethink Robotics and Robust AI. We hope you will join us then.
That brings another episode of EE Times Current to its end. Thank you for listening, and thanks to our guest, Dr. Katie Schuman. EE Times Current is available through all the major podcast platforms, but if you get to us at our website at eetimes.com, you'll find the transcript along with direct links to the other stories we've mentioned and other resources. Thanks for listening.